right? So we started this series a few weeks ago. It's called Unboxed, and this one's all about kind of looking at the reality that it's kind of easy to see my life in a little frame, and then maybe God's over here in this box. And a lot of times they don't interact, right? It's the reality is our view of God doesn't bump into our view of our life. And these things kind of are self-contained. And often we don't see God according to who he is. And what we have been talking about is the reality that if my view of God is he's small, my problems are going to feel really, really big, right? I'm going to feel overwhelmed often by my problems and by my life. And now listen, all of us are going to get hit hard by life. That's what life does, right? In a fallen, broken world, it's going to hit hard sometimes. But if I have a God who is infinite, and I'm kind of bringing that God into a situation where those problems are, it's a game changer. It changes how I view myself, changes how I view my life, and of course, it's going to change how I view who God is. So if you've maybe just jumped in with us today, I'd encourage you to maybe catch up online if you want to. You can go back and catch the last few weeks on our YouTube channel, and we talked about the reality that God is everywhere. There's really nowhere I can go where God isn't, and that God knows everything, right? That there's no secrets that really he is unaware of, and big implications to both of those realities. And then, of course, today we're going to dive into a different piece of who God is. And we've been saying this all along, of course, in this series as well, that we're just scratching the surface, guys. We only have a little bit of time, one time a week to talk about who God is. So we're just really taking a first look at him and who he is. But we want to take a good, strong look because we've been looking at this verse every week. We said this: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So if I'm going to be a person that can gain wisdom, right? If I want to know how do I live in a way that makes sense and is right and is wise, and I have understanding about my life and about the world kind of in alignment with reality, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get to know who God is. This is what the Bible's saying. And that if I see him according to who he is, I'm going to end up in reverence and awe in what the Bible would call fear, right? And those ideas are all kind of connected together. It's just the recognition of kind of my smallness in comparison to him, and the fact that he has all of this power and knowledge and wisdom that is beyond what I have access to. And the Bible's going to say, when I have that, that's where wisdom begins. If I think that I have those things, if I think that maybe think too highly of myself and don't understand who God is, I'm not going to operate in wisdom. When I see him rightly, wisdom comes along with that. So that's what we want to dive into today. And when I'm thinking about this series, and particularly this conversation, I think about a story that made a ton of sense to me. I've got a wood-burning stove, love to burn wood. And so I end up spending a lot of time chopping wood, stacking wood, making wood piles, and then burning wood. We're coming into wood burning season right now. I'm really excited about that. It's going to be good. It's going to be a lot of fun. And so a lot of my time has been spent doing that over the bunch of years here. And when we moved into the house that we're in now, we've been here for almost 10 years, and we're surrounded by woods. And I remember when I moved in, I was like, oh, man, there's a lot of trees here. As I got a little closer and recognized the trees, what I found is a bunch of those trees are pine trees, and if you're a tree person, if you know wood or whatever, what you'll tend to hear is that the only wood you can burn, like in a wood burning stove, is hardwood, so things like oak or cherry. And what I was always told is you can never burn pine inside. Okay, I was told this over and over and over again. They're like, if you burn pine inside your house, I mean, your house will catch on fire immediately. Right, like spontaneous combustion, right? Pine is the devil. Never, ever burn it. And so I was always like, oh, man, it would be so cool if I could burn some of these, because trees fall in the woods, and I could just cut them up. And rather than making useless wood piles throughout my yard or burn outside, I could put that wood to use. It'd be amazing. But it's pine, right? And so I go to Montana. I got a friend invited us to go to their place in Montana a handful of years ago. And I'm out there, and I'm a tree wonk, so I'm like looking around and looking and seeing a lot of these people seem to have wood-burning stoves, and I'm looking around at all the trees. I'm like, all of these trees are pine, like all of them. And I started asking, I'm like, what do you guys burn here? Do you import your wood from far away? Like, how does this work? And they're like, oh, yeah, we just burn pine. I was like, your house doesn't catch on fire immediately? And they were like, no, it's crazy. No. They were like, no, you just have to clean the chimney out a little bit more. It's a myth. It's a wives' tale. You can't burn pine. You can totally do it. And I was like, are you serious? All these people are doing this? And immediately I started to do the math in my head. And I realized that I've been viewing my backyard wrong the entire time. All right, I have firewood in abundance just right there on my property, and I would have counted it as useless. Now, when we think about the power of God in our lives, it shows up a lot like the trees in my yard. The reality is, I'm looking at it all the time. It's available. It's around us. I don't even see it for what it is, and I certainly don't put it into practice and have it show up and transform or affect or impact my life. That's going to be true for me. I bet it's true for you. And what we want to do in this conversation, guys, is we want to start to have our eyes open, and we want to start to see the trees. Right? We want to see the trees for what they really are. The reality of who God is and how his power can and does show up in ways that are they are deeply humbling, and they are absolutely thrilling when I start to get my heart and my mind around it. So let's dive into it. That's what we're going to talk about today. Jeremiah, he's going to say this. He says, "O sovereign Lord, you've made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm." He says, he concludes, nothing's too hard for you. Right? I love the way he's thinking. So Jeremiah's going to look and say, right, it would be God's power. In fact, it would be his words, right, that would create the heavens and the earth, all of creation. And we know this from other parts of the Bible that God would that's his power. God would speak, and then the world would be formed. We don't know exactly how that all played out, but we know that that's what played out. That God spoke the world into being, and by his power that was accomplished. And then the fact that it exists is all in light of this reality, of the power of God. Jeremiah's going to say, if that's true, if I look back at some of what God has done, which is a great idea, if I look back at what God has accomplished, that can start to build some amazing context for us to make decisions about how God might be able to work in our worlds today. He goes back and says, hey, if you create the heavens and the earth, nothing is too hard for you. And just kind of get your mind around it for a second. The fact that the world existed, was formed, was created, is an exercise. It's kind of a flex and a reality of God's power. Get your head around this. Not only is the fact that it existed or was formed, but the fact that it is sustained is another evidence of God's power. That the Bible would talk about this, that the fact that the world continues to function and thrive, and creation continues to exist, and it doesn't, the world doesn't kind of like flip off of its axis, is all a conscious exercise of God's power to keep everything together. That the Bible will talk about the fact that God holds the world together by his power. I don't even understand what I'm talking about right now. That's an enormous amount of power. I can't even fathom what that means. But Jeremiah's going to say, see, nothing's too hard for the Lord. He has this unbelievable amount of power that's available to him. And we would see this show out all throughout the story of the Bible. Let me give you at least a few examples. Another one, even if you're like me and didn't grow up in the church, you might have heard about Moses and the Red Sea. The fact that God would use Moses, and he would split the Red Sea, and there's a group of people, huge group of people, that would walk through that thing like they were walking on dry ground. right? It sounds impossible. God did that, and he actually involved a guy named Moses in that process, and it would be by God's power that played out. A bunch of us would be familiar, at least a little bit, of the miracles that Jesus would perform by his power. Some of us have watched The Chosen and kind of get some skin on it and see a little closer what that might be like. That through the person of Jesus, his power, we would see miracles done. The deaf would hear, the blind would see, the lame would walk, that people were fed from a couple fish and loaves, and 5,000 and 4,000 people would eat off of that, and Jesus would walk on the water, and the storms were stilled, and people were raised from the dead, and the miraculous played out by the power of God. God, the one who created all things and sustains it and split the Red Sea, and the miracles of the power of God showed up on earth through the person of Jesus. Say, Ryan, what does that have to do with me? Let's begin to drill this down into our lives a little bit. It says, for God who said, let light shine out of darkness, right? The God who spoke the world into creation, made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. Here's what Paul's saying here. He's saying, hey guys, the God that spoke the world, he looked at the darkness of our own heart, our inability to see God or find him, and he made a decision to say, I'm gonna open the eyes of your heart. I'm gonna help you to see my glory in the person of Christ. I want you to begin to understand, and this is where God begins to move towards us. Here's another example where Paul would pray this in Ephesians 1. I love this prayer. It's absolutely loaded. He says this in Ephesians 1, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which he's called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people. Let me break this down. Here's Paul. He's praying for a group of people. And he says, what I'm praying is that your heart would be open and it could understand some stuff. He uses this language of the eyes of your heart. That your heart's eyes would open. Right? That you would get some stuff that you maybe don't get all by yourself. And he says, in order that you may know, that know is an experiential know. It's not just knowledge. I know geography. I know where the capital of Maryland is. Not that kind of knowledge. It's the kind of knowledge that's like this. I know a person. I've experienced something. I know it. I've lived it. I've been a part of it. That your eyes of your heart would be open so that you could experience the hope to which he has called you. This hope is not a pipe dream. It's not, I hope the Browns win the Super Bowl. I hope they do, by the way, right? But that's not the kind of hope we're talking. It's not I hope something happens that may or may not happen. It's the kind of hope that's like this. I hope this stage holds me. It's an expectation. I know it's going to hold me. It's solid under my feet. I want my heart to be opened so that I could experience this sure thing, this hope, this expectation to which you've been called. What is the hope? The hope is this, that God, by his own doing, has chosen to make you and I his inheritance, his reward. He has called us and chosen to make us holy people by his power. This was God's idea. And he says, guys, this is hard to understand, so I'm going to pray this for you. That when you look at your lives and you look at yourself, that you understand how God sees you and what by his power he has called you. For the people that have said yes to Jesus, right? If you're like me and didn't grow up in church, let me back up for a second and fill in some blanks. Jesus came to the planet, lived a perfect life, died an innocent death. He did that in order to pay for all the things that you and I have done wrong. I've done a ton of things wrong. Right? If you ever cheated or lied or used the Lord's name in vain or right, any of that, look lustfully at another person, right? The Bible would say that separates us from God, and somebody has to pay for that. Who's going to pay? God says, it's my idea that my son would come and live a perfect life, and he would pay for the sins of the world, for the wrongdoing of the world. And that when somebody says yes and says, hey, I believe in Jesus, I see the offer on the table to have somebody pay for my sin, what happens is that person's sin is paid for, they're forgiven, and then Jesus, his righteousness, his good standing with God is transferred to that person. And then when God sees them, he looks and says, now you are something different. No longer are you defined the way that you were defined before. Now you are this. You are on your way to becoming what I've called you. You are forgiven and you are chosen, and now your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and all of this amazing stuff that has been taking place. And it would be the same power that God used when he created and when he split the Red Sea and when he worked through miracles. He's going to show up and say, it's my power that shows up in your life in this very unique way. I want to show you this one last piece of this prayer that Paul started. We're going to repeat a piece of it here. He says, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, that you may know, same ideas we just talked about, his incomparably great power for us who believe. He says that power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead. Paul's going to say, hey, remember that Jesus in his broken, lifeless body, dead in a tomb, it was God's power, his mighty strength that he exerted when he raised him and seated him at his right hand. And he says, hey, that power that was available to Jesus, that raised him and resurrected him and seated him in the heavenlies, that power is available and is accessible to you and I here and now. And he's like, I know that you can't see that and you can't know that because our experience of life isn't like that. My experience of life and yours is different than that. Here, right? You and I experience life like this. You ever have somebody say something to you and it destroys a portion of your life? Somebody looks at you and says, you're a loser. You'll never amount to anything. There's nothing, you can't do it. You're worthless. People like you don't do. On and on and on. And these voices ring in our heads. Think about the damage that's been done by some of the worst things that a human being has looked at you and said. Think about the risks that you didn't take because you believed the voice of an uncle or a coach or a parent or a teacher. When they looked at you and said, you're nothing. You can't. Right? All of those things. In our experience of life, in our experience of our own guilt and our own shame, because we've done wrong things, it's very hard for us to believe that the power of God is available for people like you and me. That the resurrection power that showed up for Jesus is able to show up in the parts of my life that I'm super frustrated with. That God would look at us and say, hey, I know that you're a work in progress and you don't feel like this is true. But when I look at you, I want you to understand it was my idea to look at you and call you forgiven. It was my idea to change you from a from a slave and make you a son or a daughter. It was my idea to make you free. It was my idea to say, hey, I don't define you by your sin anymore. I define you by my mercy. God's idea, not mine. And so what happens is the trees are all around us, and we sit and feel helpless, without resources, without an ability to change, without ability to move forward. And sometimes, like the beginning of the prayer, we feel hopeless. Where are we going to go? Our world is crazy, right? And we get sucked up into the conversation of the day, and we forget that life's not always going to be like it is right now. It's not always going to be election season. Praise Jesus, right? Everybody said amen to that one, right? I forget that. I forget that. And God would look and say, I know all the things. There's nowhere you can go where I'm not. And when I show up, I show up and I want to bring transformation into your heart and your life and your mind. And the circumstances that you're in are not nearly as important as what I want to do on the inside. The transformation that's going to play out in you. I got to tell my story this week. I had an opportunity to talk to a bunch of counselors about what God has done in me. That I grew up in a home where there's no faith. We had no religious background. Broken home where there's some divorce. And I talked about the thrashing around that I did in life, trying to figure out what I'm doing with myself. Trying to find an identity. Trying to solve my deep struggles with myself. And when I bumped into a brick wall, I'm like, I can't change me. I can't take care of the pride in my heart, and I can't take care of the lust in my heart, and I can't change me. I need somebody to change me. I need more power than I have available to me. I'm out of trees. And it wouldn't be until my buddy came and told me about Jesus that I found the reality that was there the whole time. That the entirety of my life, while I was languishing, trying to find and grope for hope in some dark place, God was looking at me, inviting me, and offering me relationship. It was on the table the whole time. And what I didn't know then, that I'm starting to know now, is that I didn't have to muster myself into a different kind of person. All I had to do was believe. Like a little child. I had to believe and have faith that God's power was going to work in my life. That if God said this is who I am, then that's who I am. That no longer am I a kid loaded with guilt. Now I can be forgiven and live with a clear conscience. Not because of any righteous thing I've done, but because of the righteousness of Christ. And guys, this is what Paul's saying in essence. Guys, if I had one thing I wanted to pray for you, it's this. I need you to understand it. I know it's hard to get a hold of. But he would look at us, I believe, and he would say, listen, I need you to, by the power of God, I need you to understand who you are. Here's who you're not. You're not defined by your looks or what the scale says or your net worth or your income. You're not defined by your skin color or your age or what gender you are. You're not defined by how you feel sexually about somebody else. You're not defined by the sins that you've committed in the past. You're not defined by the substances that you've used growing up. You're not defined by the feelings that you felt about yourself. You're not defined by what you've done with another human being relationally. You're not defined by the family that you came from. You're not defined by the massive failure that you had in your past, and it's the reason why you don't move forward and take risks now. None of that is who you are. Here's what Paul's saying. He said, I need your heart to open up so that you can begin to see who you really are. Because God said that's who you are. Where he would look at you and say, You're no longer fat or skinny or beautiful or ugly. You're my temple. If you said yes to Jesus, that's who you are today. Did you know that? Hair or no hair, temple, right? It's who you are. Brilliant or simple, child of God. Enormously gifted, or man, I have this one thing to offer. In the family, servant. Paul's saying, God, I pray that they would understand this. I pray that they would be set free. Because people who know this power, who believe the voice of God, the voice that created heavens and earth, when we believe that, what happens is all of a sudden, when I approach my life and my days, it all expands. And things start to happen that nobody believed could happen. Nobody believed that guy could get sober, and he's sober. Nobody believed that this guy would ever be a pastor and be standing on this stage today. Right? Literally, a friend from high school said I was most likely to be a cult leader. I don't know how to feel about that, okay? Guys, this stuff is crazy. This stuff is crazy. If you would have looked and said, Ryan, in 20 years from now, if you would have told me at 18, in 20-some years from now, you're going to have a stable family. You're going to have an amazing relationship with your children. You're going to have a marriage that's 2 decades plus. You're going to have a clear conscience before God, even though you've experienced all kinds of moral failure. You're going to have a purpose that you can hold on to no matter what happens in this life. You're going to have a reason to get out of bed in the morning. You're going to find what you're looking for. I would have looked at you and said, I have no idea where you find what you're talking about, but I want it. See, this is what Paul's talking about, folks. This is why this is not just like, hey, I'm going to church on Sunday. It's fun and neat. I'm a good person. Stop. God doesn't need you to be a good person. He's calling you to be a radical, changed, altered person that is defined by love and is defined by his power. And he looks at you and he says, I have plans and ideas and thoughts for your life that you can't even fathom. Guys, nobody thought what was happening right now in this room was possible 5 years ago. You understand that? I'm not even sure I believed it. But by the power of God, this is playing out. So here's where we start to think different. If that power is real in my life, if I'm not just sitting, staring at the trees, thinking, I don't know who can help me. If I start to open my eyes and realize that there is power and resource all around, I start to approach life different. I'm going to go get counseling because health is available. I'm going to go get recovery because sobriety is available. We're going to believe that God can change and move us and move our marriage. Why? Not because of anything we've done, but because the power of God is real. I'm going to have the security to grow and to change. See, so it starts to change everything? It starts to change everything. We start to think about our impact here in the community differently. Who would have ever thought that God would build a church where 56 people are baptized in 2024? When we were a church that was homeless, literally, of a couple hundred people with nowhere to meet, just 4 years ago. Guys, this is stuff that only God can do. When I look at my story, I say, God, this is something only you can do. When I hear the stories over and over again, a young man that accepted Jesus on Monday, who had no religious background, and here's what he said. When he shows up here on the weekend, he said, I can come just as I am. I don't have to change who I am to learn about Jesus and let him change me. I don't have to wear special clothes or say special words. I can have tattoos and just be myself. Praise Jesus. Guys, the power of God, the reality of who he is and what he can do, it is not just some theory out there somewhere. This power shows up in my moments of frustration with myself, in my moments where I want to throw in the towel. For me, I feel it most when I'm feeling afraid, which happens a lot. When I think about what God's calling us to, I feel afraid sometimes. And I remember that we have a God that can raise the dead, that can change a heart, that can sustain me, that can sustain you. When I feel like I don't know if I can make it, how far can I make it? How far can I keep going? I can remember that there's a power that sustains the planet. He can probably sustain me. He can probably continue to show up in my life, and he probably cares more about who I am and who I'm becoming than I do. Guys, that's why this whole conversation, it's not about showing up and doing some good stuff. It's about being like a little child and hearing those words of God and hearing them fresh. See, these words are for me. That you hear the Father say to you today, you are my son or my daughter with whom I'm well pleased. You're an ambassador of Jesus. You are a temple of the Holy Spirit. You're a royal priest. You're the place my Spirit lives. You're chosen. I picked you. I've redeemed you. I have fought for you. I have set you free. I have called you by your name and invited you into my family. I have gifted you with spiritual gifts that will be used to help others. I look at you. Zephaniah says, I rejoice over you with singing. When God looks at you, he's not looking at you and thinking, I'm barely holding on to patience with that one. They're on their last straw and then I'm done. He's eager to have you grab hold of his power for you. And he is glorified. He looks good when you find faith in him. Guys, this conversation's a game changer. And I wish there was a simple magic wand I could wave and have all of our eyes open to it. I think that's why Paul prayed this. Lord, you can do that. So here might be the question that we walk away with today. What are the trees that are all around you right now that you just can't see? How is God's power available? How is his voice speaking? How is he offering forgiveness or peace or reassurance right now? I didn't even know it was there. Because this is a God who is worthy of our worship, our faith. God worthy of receiving his voice because it brings life from the dead and it brings light out of darkness. As the band comes out, would you bow your heads, close your eyes with me, sing and worship together. Lord, this is my prayer for myself, Lord, and for all of us. Would you open the eyes of our hearts, Lord? God, would you help us to experience the depth, the reality, the power of what's available right now, the promises of God for us. God, I pray that that would become all-consuming in our hearts and minds. In the middle of that struggle, in that tension, in that problem, God, you can provide, you can sustain, you can repair, you can transform. Nothing is too hard for you, Lord. God, would you help us today to believe, to see reality and see you for what you really are. Meet us here, Lord.